I collapsed and lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. I called my son desperately, but he never came. When I discovered that I had signed a document making him CEO, my spine froze. That's when the doctor told me, "Sir, you need to run. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Stanley, and I'm 67 years old. 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew my son. I thought I understood the business I'd built with my own hands over 40 years. I thought the headaches and confusion I'd been experiencing were just signs of getting older. I was wrong about everything. It started on a Tuesday morning in September. I was sitting in my office at Morrison Construction, the company I founded when Michael was just 5 years old. The morning sun streamed through the windows overlooking the warehouse where my crews stored equipment worth over $2 million. I'd been feeling off for weeks, dizzy spells, moments where I'd forget what I was saying mid-sentence, a constant fog that seemed to cloud my thoughts. Michael had been visiting more frequently lately, always with his wife Jessica. They'd sit across from my desk, their faces filled with what I thought was concern. "Dad, you've been working too hard," Michael would say, his voice gentle but insistent. "Maybe it's time to think about stepping back." Jessica would nod sympathetically, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap. "We just want what's best for you, Stanley. The company needs fresh leadership, someone who can handle the stress." The pressure had been building for months. Every conversation somehow circled back to my declining health, my memory issues, my need to modernize the business. They brought in consultants who spoke in corporate jargon I'd never needed in 40 years of successful operation. They suggested digital systems to replace the personal relationships I'd built with every contractor, every supplier, every client. That Tuesday morning, Michael arrived earlier than usual. I was reviewing the quarterly reports, numbers that had been consistently strong despite their concerns, when he knocked on my door. "Dad, we need to talk." His tone was different somehow, more urgent. "I've been thinking about what we discussed last week." I looked up from the papers, squinting slightly. The headache was starting again, that dull throbbing behind my eyes that had become my constant companion. "What exactly did we discuss, son?" He exchanged a glance with Jessica, who had followed him in. There was something in that look, something I couldn't quite place, about the succession plan, about making the transition official. I rubbed my temples, trying to focus. The words seemed to swim together on the page in front of me. "I don't remember agreeing to anything definitive, Dad." Jessica's voice was soft, almost patronizing. "You've been forgetting a lot lately. Yesterday you asked me 3 times what day it was. Last week you couldn't remember the Henderson Project details." The Henderson Project. I tried to recall the specifics, but the details felt slippery, just out of reach. Had I really forgotten? The uncertainty gnawed at me. "Look," Michael said, leaning forward in his chair. "I've already drafted the paperwork. It's just a formality, really. You'll still be involved, but I'll handle the day-to-day operations. Take some pressure off you." He slid a thick folder across my desk. The documents inside looked official, filled with legal language that seemed to blur together. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting, watching. The headache intensified. "I don't know," I said slowly. "This feels rushed. Dad." Michael's voice carried a note of frustration he tried to hide. "We've been discussing this for months. The doctors even said—" "What doctors?" I interrupted. "I haven't seen any doctors." Another look passed between them. "Dr. Peterson?" Jessica said gently. "Remember? The physical you had 2 weeks ago? He was concerned about your cognitive function." I stared at her, searching my memory. There were gaps, holes where conversations should have been. The admission terrified me more than I wanted to admit. My hands shook slightly as I reached for a pen. The signature line seemed to mock me, waiting for the stroke that would change everything. I thought about my late wife, Margaret, who had always been the steady voice of reason in our family. What would she have said? But Margaret wasn't here, and the pain in my head was getting worse. I signed the papers. The collapse happened 3 hours later. I was alone in the office trying to make sense of the quarterly projections when the room began to spin. The numbers on the page dissolved into meaningless symbols. I gripped the edge of my desk, but my vision darkened at the edges. The last thing I remembered was the sound of papers scattering as I hit the floor. I woke up in Mercy General Hospital with fluorescent lights burning into my retinas and the steady beep of machines monitoring my vital signs. My mouth felt like cotton, and my thoughts moved like thick syrup. A nurse with kind eyes checked my IV drip. "How long have I been here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. 2 days, honey. You gave everyone quite a scare." 2 days. I tried to piece together what had happened, but everything after signing those papers was a blank. I asked for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed Michael's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. He's probably just busy, the nurse said, but her smile seemed forced. I called 6 more times over the next 8 hours. Michael never answered. Jessica didn't either. Not once. The panic started as a flutter in my chest, then grew into something darker. They were my family. Where were they? Dr. Harrison, a man about my age with silver hair and tired eyes, visited me on the 3rd day. He reviewed my chart with a frown that deepened as he read. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." He pulled a chair close to my bed and lowered his voice. "Do you remember signing any legal documents recently?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "The succession papers, how did you know?" Dr. Harrison's expression grew grave. "Because someone called yesterday asking about your mental capacity. They wanted documentation of cognitive decline for legal purposes." "Who called?" "Your son." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Michael had been checking on my mental state not out of concern, but for documentation. While I lay unconscious in a hospital bed, he had been building a case. "There's something else," Dr. Harrison continued, glancing toward the door as if making sure we weren't overheard. "Your blood work shows elevated levels of certain substances that shouldn't be there. Substances that can cause confusion, memory loss, and disorientation." I stared at him, my mind racing despite the fog that still clouded my thoughts. "Are you saying someone was poisoning me?" "I'm saying you need to be very careful who you trust. And Stanley." He stood up, his hand briefly touching my shoulder. "If I were you, I'd get somewhere safe before they come back." The machines around me seemed to beep faster as my heart rate spiked. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, my son, it was all crumbling around me. I needed to understand what I had signed away, and I needed to understand it before Michael realized I was awake and thinking clearly again. Dr. Harrison's words echoed in my head long after he left the room. Poisoned. The word felt foreign, impossible. This was my son we were talking about. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, walked down the aisle at his wedding, the man I'd groomed to take over the business I'd spent 40 years building. But as I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles, pieces began falling into place like a jigsaw puzzle I'd been unknowingly solving for months. The coffee. Every morning for the past 3 months, Michael had insisted on bringing me coffee from that new place downtown. "Dad, you work too hard. Let me at least make sure you start your day right." I'd been touched by the gesture, this small sign that my busy son was thinking of his old man. Now I remembered how bitter it had tasted, different from my usual black coffee. "It's a special blend," Michael had explained when I mentioned it. "Supposed to be good for focus and energy." I'd drunk it anyway, grateful for his thoughtfulness. The morning routine had become sacred to him. If I tried to make my own coffee, he'd look genuinely hurt. "Dad, I got you the good stuff. Don't waste money on that generic brand." He'd actually thrown away a perfectly good bag of my regular coffee, claiming it was expired. I thought about the timing. The confusion, the memory lapses, the headaches, they'd all started around the same time Michael began his daily coffee deliveries. That evening, I called my longtime secretary, Martha, from the hospital phone. She'd been with Morrison Construction for 22 years, had watched Michael grow up. Oh, if anyone would tell me the truth, it would be her. "Oh, Stanley." Her voice was thick with relief. "How are you feeling? We've all been so worried." "Martha, I need you to be honest with me. How have I been acting lately? At work, I mean. Have you noticed anything different?" There was a pause, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Well, you have seemed a bit scattered, forgetting appointments, losing track of conversations. But Stanley, you've been under tremendous stress with Michael pushing all these changes." "What changes?" "The new computer systems, the staff reorganization, the client relationship reviews. He's been saying you approved everything, but some of the decisions seemed so unlike you." My stomach twisted. "What kind of decisions?" "He let go of 3 of our longest-term foremen last week. Said you wanted to streamline operations." "But Stanley, these men have been with us for over 15 years. Tom Rodriguez has been your right hand since 2008. I closed my eyes. Tom Rodriguez had saved my life once, literally, when scaffolding collapsed on a job site. He'd pulled me out from under a falling beam and stayed with me until the ambulance came. I would never have fired Tom, not in a million years. "Martha, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to keep it between us. Can you access the personnel files? I want to know exactly what I supposedly approved and when. Stanley, are you sure? Michael said not to bother you with work details while you recover. I'm sure. The next morning, Martha called back with information that made my blood run cold. According to the files, I had signed off on a complete restructuring of the company. Key employees had been terminated, long-time contracts had been canceled, vendor relationships my father had established in the 1970s had been severed. But here was the thing. I didn't remember approving any of it. Martha, the signatures on these documents, can you fax copies to me here at the hospital? When the papers arrived an hour later, I studied them carefully. The signatures looked like mine, but something was off. The slant was slightly different, the pressure uneven. These weren't just documents I'd forgotten signing. These were documents I'd never signed at all. Michael had been forging my signature. I asked Martha to pull the security footage from the office. Our system kept recordings for 90 days. I'll have the IT guy pull what you need, she said. But Stanley, Michael's been in your office a lot when you weren't there. Said he was organizing files for you. That afternoon, I studied the security footage on my phone. There was Michael, alone in my office at 7 in the morning, 3 weeks earlier. I watched him open my desk drawer, pull out my signature stamp, the one I used for routine documents, and begin working through a stack of papers. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just business ambition or impatience with an aging father. This was calculated theft. Michael had been systematically taking apart the company I'd built, piece by piece, while slowly poisoning me to make me compliant. But why? I'd always planned to leave him the business. He was my only child, my heir. What could possibly drive him to such deception? The answer came in an unexpected phone call later that day. A woman's voice, hesitant and nervous. Mr. Morrison, this is Sandra Williams. I used to work for your son and daughter-in-law's consulting firm. I didn't know Michael and Jessica had a consulting firm. I'm calling because I saw on social media that you were in the hospital and I thought you should know. They've been planning this for over a year. They have documents, spreadsheets, projections about liquidating Morrison Construction. They were calling it Project Liberation. My hands went numb. What do you mean, liquidating? They don't want to run your company, Mr. Morrison. They want to sell it, break it up and sell the pieces. The land alone is worth $12 million, and they already have buyers lined up for the equipment and client contracts. $12 million. No wonder Michael had been so eager to get control. There's more, Sandra continued. Jessica, she's done this before. She convinced her first husband to sign over his restaurant business, then divorced him after she sold it. Michael doesn't know about her first marriage. The room seemed to tilt around me. Jessica wasn't just a manipulative daughter-in-law. She was a predator who had selected my son specifically for this con, and Michael, blinded by love and greed, had become her willing accomplice. I thought about Margaret, my wife of 38 years, who had died 2 years earlier. She'd never liked Jessica, had always said there was something calculating about her. That girl looks at our house like she's appraising it, Margaret had observed after their first dinner together. I'd dismissed her concerns as maternal jealousy. Now I realized Margaret had seen exactly what Jessica was from the beginning. After Sandra hung up, I sat in the hospital bed staring at my hands. These hands had built walls, poured foundations, created something lasting and good. These hands had held my son when he was small, taught him to use tools, showed him what honest work looked like. And my son had repaid me by slowly poisoning me while forging my signature to steal everything I'd worked for. The worst part wasn't the money or even the company. The worst part was that Michael had looked me in the eye every morning, handed me that bitter coffee, and smiled while he destroyed me. But I wasn't destroyed yet, and if my son thought 67 years old meant helpless, he was about to learn how wrong he could be. I had built Morrison Construction from nothing once before. I'd survived the recession of 2008, the supply shortages of 2020, the labor disputes of the early 2000s. I'd buried my wife and kept working. I'd survived a heart attack at 59 and been back on job sites within a month. Michael had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd underestimated his father. The nurses thought I was sleeping when I made the call that would change everything. But I wasn't sleeping. I was planning. The call I made from that hospital bed was to someone I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, my brother David. We'd had a falling out over our father's estate, something that seemed petty and meaningless now. But David was a retired federal investigator, and if anyone could help me understand the legal mess I was in, it was him. Stanley? His voice was surprised, but not unwelcoming. I heard about Margaret. I'm sorry I didn't make it to the funeral. David, I need help. I think my son is trying to steal my company. There was a long pause. Tell me everything. I spent an hour walking David through the details, the coffee, the forged signatures, the mysterious documents I'd signed while confused. David listened without interruption and I could hear him taking notes. Stanley, what you're describing sounds like elder abuse, financial exploitation. It's a federal crime if the amounts are large enough, and 12 million definitely qualifies. But he's my son. That makes it worse, not better. Family members who do this know exactly which emotional buttons to push. They count on the victim being too ashamed or heartbroken to fight back. David arranged to fly in from Phoenix the next day. He also suggested something that chilled me to the bone. Don't let them know you're onto them yet. Keep pretending you're confused. We need to document everything before they realize you figured it out. That evening, Michael finally showed up at the hospital. He walked in with a bouquet of flowers and that same concerned expression he'd worn for months. But now I could see the calculation behind his eyes. Dad, thank God you're awake. We were so worried. He set the flowers on the bedside table and pulled up a chair. How are you feeling? I forced myself to look confused, disoriented. Michael, what happened to me? You had an episode at the office. Stress-related, the doctors think. You've been pushing yourself too hard. I let my voice sound weak, uncertain. I don't remember much, did I? Did I sign some papers recently? Something flickered across his face, relief mixed with guilt. Just some routine business documents, Dad. Nothing important. Don't worry about work right now. But the company is in good hands. I'm taking care of everything just like we discussed. You need to focus on getting better. Jessica arrived a few minutes later carrying a small bag. I brought you some of your favorite coffee, she said with a bright smile. I know hospital coffee is terrible. I stared at the bag, understanding completely now. They were planning to continue drugging me even here in the hospital. The audacity of it was breathtaking. That's so thoughtful, I said, accepting the bag with trembling hands. But the doctors have me on a restricted diet right now, maybe later. Of course, Jessica said, but I caught the flash of annoyance she tried to hide. They stayed for 20 minutes, filling the air with meaningless chatter about my health and their concern. When they left, promising to return tomorrow, I waited exactly 30 minutes before calling David back. They just tried to give me more of the drugged coffee in the hospital. Jesus Christ, Stanley, these people are dangerous. I'm flying out tonight. David arrived the next morning looking like the federal agent he'd once been. Sharp suit, careful eyes, and a briefcase full of legal documents. He'd spent the red-eye flight researching elder abuse cases and had some sobering news. I've seen cases like this before. The pattern is always the same. Isolate the victim, create confusion and dependency, then systematically strip away their assets. The fact that they're continuing to try to drug you suggests they're not done yet. What do you mean? Think about it, Stanley. They have control of the company now, but you're still alive. You could potentially challenge what you signed. You could tell people what really happened, for their plan to work completely. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood. As long as I was alive and coherent, I was a threat to them. We need to move fast, David continued. I've already contacted a lawyer who specializes in elder abuse cases. Patricia Chen. She's tough as nails and she hates people who prey on seniors. Patricia arrived that afternoon. She was a small woman in her 40s with the kind of intense focus that made you understand why she'd never lost a case. She reviewed the documents David had gathered, her expression growing darker with each page. Mr. Morrison, this is one of the most systematic cases of elder abuse I've seen. They didn't just steal from you. They created an entire false narrative about your mental decline to justify it. She showed me printouts that made my stomach turn. Michael had been posting on social media about my deteriorating condition, sharing photos of me looking confused or tired, building a public record of my supposed dementia. Look at this, Patricia pointed to a Facebook post from 3 weeks earlier. Michael wrote, "Please keep my dad in your prayers," and his Alzheimer's is progressing faster than we hoped. He barely recognizes me some days. Alzheimer's. He'd told the world I had Alzheimer's disease. The comments below the post were heartbreaking. Friends expressing sympathy, offering support, sharing their own stories of losing parents to dementia. Michael had turned my entire social circle into unwitting accomplices in his narrative. But the worst part, Patricia continued, is this. She handed me another document. It was a life insurance policy I'd never seen before, taken out 6 months earlier. The beneficiary was Michael, and the payout was $5 million. I never signed this, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew that didn't matter. My signature was there, just like on all the other documents. Mr. Morrison, people don't usually take out large life insurance policies on their elderly parents unless they're planning something. Combined with the systematic poisoning, she didn't need to spell it out. Michael wasn't just stealing my company, he was planning to kill me. That night, alone in my hospital room, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how my life had come to this. I thought about the little boy who used to follow me around job sites, wearing a tiny hard hat and asking endless questions about construction. I remembered teaching him to read blueprints, explaining the importance of honest work, showing him how to treat employees with respect. When had that little boy turned into someone who could look at his father and see only dollar signs? I thought about Jessica's influence, her history of targeting vulnerable men for their assets. But Michael wasn't a naive victim, he was an active participant. He'd made conscious choices every step of the way. The hardest part was accepting that my son, the child I'd loved and protected and provided for, genuinely wanted me dead. David returned the next morning with more devastating news. He'd been investigating Jessica's background and had found records of 3 previous marriages, all to older men with assets. 2 of those men had died under suspicious circumstances within 2 years of marrying her. Stanley, your son married a serial killer. But Michael doesn't know about her history, right? Maybe if we told him. David shook his head grimly. I found text messages between them. Michael knows exactly who she is and what she's done. In fact, it was his idea to speed up the timeline. He showed me printouts of texts between Michael and Jessica from 2 weeks earlier. Michael, the old man is getting suspicious. We need to move faster. Jessica, I can increase the dosage. Make it look like natural progression. Michael, good, I want this over with before Christmas. I'm tired of pretending to care. Those last words hit me like a physical blow. I'm tired of pretending to care. Months of concerned visits, gentle conversations about my health, worried glances with Jessica. All of it had been an act. I'd raised a monster, and now that monster was coming to finish what he'd started. But I had one advantage they didn't know about. I was no longer the confused, vulnerable old man they thought they were manipulating. I was Stanley Morrison, and I'd built everything they wanted to steal with my own hands. If they wanted a war, they'd picked the wrong enemy. The revelation about the life insurance policy and Michael's text messages changed everything. This wasn't just theft anymore, this was attempted murder. But Patricia Chen had given me hope along with the devastating news. Mr. Morrison, there's something you need to know about the documents you signed, she said, pulling out a thick legal folder. I've reviewed everything, and there's a problem with the succession paperwork, a big problem. I leaned forward in my hospital bed, ignoring the IV tube that pulled at my arm. The power of attorney and corporate transfer documents were filed incorrectly. Your son's lawyer made a crucial error. They didn't properly notarize several key pages, and they filed in the wrong jurisdiction. Legally speaking, those documents are invalid. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. What does that mean exactly? It means you're still the legal owner and CEO of Morrison Construction. Michael has been operating under false authority. Every decision he's made, every contract he's signed, every person he's fired, none of it is legally binding. David whistled low. Amateur hour. They got cocky. But here's the real kicker. Patricia continued with a smile that reminded me why she never lost cases. Because Michael has been representing himself as the legal CEO while knowing the documents were invalid, he's committed fraud. Criminal fraud. Can we prove he knew? Oh yes, I've already requested records from his lawyer's office. There are emails going back 6 weeks where they discuss the filing problems. Michael chose to proceed anyway. That afternoon, Patricia and David helped me understand the full scope of what Michael had been planning. Using the invalid documents, he'd already signed preliminary agreements to sell 3 major pieces of company property. He'd terminated contracts worth over $800,000. He'd liquidated the employee pension fund and transferred the money to an account Jessica controlled. The good news, David explained, is that all of these transactions can be reversed since he had no legal authority to make them. The bad news is that we need to move fast. Once they realize you're onto them, they'll either accelerate their timeline or disappear entirely. What do you mean, disappear? Patricia showed me airline confirmations she'd obtained through legal channels. They have tickets to the Cayman Islands booked for next week. One-way tickets. The plan was becoming clear. Michael and Jessica intended to liquidate everything they could grab, transfer the money offshore, and disappear before anyone realized what had happened, and they planned to do it after I was dead, making it look like a grieving son taking over his deceased father's affairs. We need them to make their move while we can still catch them, Patricia said, which means we need you to play along for a few more days. The idea of continuing to pretend while my son planned my murder was almost unbearable, but I understood the strategy. We needed evidence of active conspiracy, not just past crimes. That evening, Michael and Jessica returned for another visit. I forced myself to appear weak and disoriented, even though every instinct screamed at me to confront them. "Dad, you look better today," Michael said, but his eyes were calculating, assessing. "The doctors say you might be able to come home soon." Home. The word sent a chill through me. In their minds, home was where they could control my environment completely, where they could increase the poisoning without medical supervision. "I miss my own bed," I said, letting my voice sound wistful and tired. "And my morning coffee routine." Jessica brightened. "Speaking of which, I brought you another bag of that special blend. I know how much you love it." She pulled out an identical bag to the one I'd refused the day before. This time I accepted it with shaking hands. "Thank you, dear. You're so thoughtful." "We just want you to be comfortable, Dad," Michael said. "We've been preparing the house for when you come home, making sure everything is ready for your condition." What kind of preparations, I wondered? Had they already purchased whatever they planned to use to finish me off? After they left, I handed the coffee bag to David, who'd been waiting in the hospital cafeteria. "Send this to the lab immediately. I want to know exactly what they're putting in it." The results came back the next morning and confirmed our worst fears. The coffee contained a cocktail of substances: benzodiazepines to cause confusion and memory loss, digitalis to affect heart rhythm, and something called succinylcholine, a paralytic agent used in anesthesia that, in the right dose, could cause respiratory failure. "This isn't just abuse anymore," Patricia said grimly. "This is a murder weapon." David was already on the phone with federal authorities. "We have enough evidence now to make arrests, but we need to be strategic about timing." "What do you mean? If we arrest them now, they'll claim they were just trying to help you, that they didn't know the coffee was dangerous. Jessica will say she got the blend from some health food store and had no idea what was in it. We need them to escalate, to do something that makes their intent undeniable." The plan Patricia and David devised was risky, but brilliant. We would let Michael know I was being discharged in 2 days, supposedly to return home under his care. This would force them to accelerate their timeline, hopefully into making a mistake that would provide irrefutable evidence of attempted murder. "The key," Patricia explained, "is that we'll be watching everything. FBI surveillance will be monitoring the house, recording devices will capture every conversation, and a medical examiner will be standing by to document any attempts to poison you. And if something goes wrong, it won't," David said firmly. "We'll pull you out the moment there's any real danger." That afternoon I had a conversation with Dr. Harrison that was partially real and partially performance. We knew Michael had people monitoring my medical status, so we needed to give them the information that would trigger their final move. "Mr. Morrison, I'm pleased to say you've recovered well from your episode," Dr. Harrison said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nurse's station to overhear. "Your cognitive function appears to be returning to normal. We'll be discharging you day after tomorrow." I saw one of the nurses, someone I didn't recognize, immediately reach for her phone. Within an hour, Michael was calling to check on my progress. "Dad, that's wonderful news about coming home. Jessica and I are so excited to take care of you." "I can't wait," I lied. "I miss my regular routine." "Don't worry, we'll make sure everything goes back to exactly the way it was." After I hung up, I sat in my hospital bed contemplating the magnitude of what my son had become. This wasn't just greed or impatience, this was cold-blooded calculation. Michael had looked at his father and decided my life was worth less than the money he could steal from my death. But I had one more card to play, something neither Michael nor Jessica knew about. Before Margaret died, she'd insisted on setting up a separate safety account, money I could access independently if anything ever happened to our main finances. "You never know when you might need resources people don't know about," she'd said with that practical wisdom that had made her such a good partner for 40 years. At the time, I'd thought she was being overly cautious. Now I realized my wife had been preparing for exactly this situation. Margaret had seen something in Michael that I'd been too blind to recognize, and she'd tried to protect me from beyond the grave. The account contained $250,000. Enough to disappear if I needed to, enough to fight back if I chose to, enough to rebuild if they succeeded in taking everything else. Margaret had always been smarter than me. Even in death, she was still taking care of her husband. The next 24 hours would determine whether I lived or died, whether justice would be served or whether my son would get away with murder. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt ready for whatever came next. Michael thought he was hunting a confused old man. He was about to discover he'd been stalking a predator who'd just run out of patience. The morning of my discharge, I woke up feeling like a man preparing for his own execution. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was voluntarily walking into a trap set by my own son, trusting that strangers would save me from the child I'd raised and loved for 37 years. David arrived early, dressed as a hospital orderly. The FBI surveillance team was already in position around my house, though I couldn't see them. Patricia would be monitoring everything from a van parked 3 blocks away, ready to coordinate with law enforcement the moment Michael and Jessica made their move. "Remember," David whispered as he helped me into the wheelchair for my discharge. "Act weak, but not too weak. We need them to feel confident enough to proceed, but not so confident they get reckless." The ride home felt surreal. Michael drove while Jessica sat in the passenger seat, both of them chatting cheerfully about how good it would be to have me back in familiar surroundings. If I hadn't known better, they would have seemed like devoted family members excited to care for an aging relative. "We've made some changes to make things easier for you, Dad," Michael said as we pulled into my driveway. "Simplified your routine, organized your medications, that sort of thing." The house looked exactly the same from the outside, but I could feel the wrongness the moment I stepped through the front door. It was subtle. Family photos had been moved, personal items had been relocated. The furniture arrangement was slightly different. They'd been living here, making themselves at home while I was in the hospital. "Let's get you settled in your chair," Jessica said, guiding me to my usual recliner in the living room. "I'll make you some coffee. I know how much you've missed your morning routine." I watched her disappear into the kitchen, knowing she was preparing what they intended to be my final cup of coffee. The recording devices David had hidden throughout the house would capture everything. The surveillance team outside was ready to intervene if things went too far. But sitting in my own living room, surrounded by 40 years of memories, the reality of what was happening hit me like a sledgehammer. This was where Margaret and I had raised Michael. This was where we'd celebrated his birthdays, helped him with homework, comforted him through childhood disappointments. These walls had witnessed countless family dinners, holiday celebrations, quiet evenings watching television together. And now my son was using this same space to plan my murder. "Here we go," Jessica said, returning with a steaming mug. "Your favorite blend." The coffee smelled exactly like it had for months, that bitter undertone I'd attributed to the special blend. Now I knew it was the taste of poison, carefully calibrated to kill me slowly while maintaining plausible deniability. I accepted the mug with trembling hands, praying that David and Patricia's plan would work before I actually had to drink enough to hurt myself. "Dad, we need to talk about a few things while you're feeling alert," Michael said, settling into the chair across from me. "Some business matters that need your attention." "Of course, son. Whatever you need." He pulled out another folder of documents, these even thicker than the ones I'd signed in the hospital. I recognized some of the paperwork: property deeds, bank account transfers, insurance policy updates. "These are just formalities," Michael explained, his voice gentle and patient. "Updating beneficiaries, streamlining the estate planning, making sure everything is properly organized." I pretended to study the papers, but I was really watching Jessica. She kept glancing at the coffee mug in my hands, checking to see how much I'd consumed. When I lifted it to my lips but didn't actually drink, she stepped forward. "Stanley, your coffee is getting cold. You always used to say coffee wasn't worth drinking unless it was hot." The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. I took a small sip, just enough to satisfy her, hoping the trace amount wouldn't be enough to affect me significantly. "That's better," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Michael spread the documents across the coffee table. "I know this is a lot to process, Dad, but we want to make sure everything is in order, especially given your health concerns." "What health concerns?" I asked, trying to sound confused. "I feel fine." Michael and Jessica exchanged a look, the same calculating expression I'd seen in the hospital. "Dad, you've been having memory issues, confusion, disorientation. The doctors are concerned about early-stage dementia." "Dementia?" I let genuine fear creep into my voice. "But I don't feel. It's early stages," Jessica said soothingly. "That's why it's so important to get these legal matters settled now, while you're still competent to make decisions." The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. They were using my fear of cognitive decline to pressure me into signing away my remaining assets, while simultaneously poisoning me to create the very symptoms they claimed I already had. "I suppose that makes sense," I said slowly, reaching for a pen with shaking hands. "I don't want to be a burden on anyone." "You could never be a burden, Dad," Michael said, but his eagerness as I approached the signature line betrayed his true feelings. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of car doors closing outside. Multiple doors, more than would be normal for my quiet neighborhood on a Tuesday afternoon. Michael heard it too. He froze, his hand halfway to the documents, his eyes darting toward the window. "Expecting someone, Dad?" Jessica asked, but her voice had lost its gentle tone. "I don't think so," I said honestly. The doorbell rang. Michael stood up quickly, his face pale. "I'll get it." "No need," came a voice from the front door. Federal agents, we have a warrant. The next few minutes were chaos. FBI agents flooded into my living room, their weapons drawn, their voices sharp and commanding. Michael backed against the wall, his hands raised, his face cycling through confusion, fear, and then sudden understanding. "Dad?" His voice was small, almost childlike. "Dad, what's happening?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, for what I knew would be the last time. Even caught red-handed, even surrounded by evidence of his crimes, he was still trying to manipulate me, still calling me Dad, as if that word meant anything after what he'd done. "What's happening, Michael, is that you're under arrest for attempted murder." Agent Sarah Martinez, the lead investigator, stepped forward with handcuffs. "Michael Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, fraud, and a dozen other federal charges." "This is insane!" Michael protested as the cuffs clicked into place. "I was taking care of my father." "He's confused, disoriented. Ask anyone." "We did ask someone," Agent Martinez replied. "We asked the lab technician who analyzed the coffee your wife has been bringing him. Fascinating blend, benzodiazepines, digitalis, and succinylcholine. That last one is particularly interesting. It's not something you'd find in a health food store." Jessica had gone completely still, her face a mask of composed calculation. Even now, caught in the act, she was planning her next move. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said calmly. "I purchased that coffee from a specialty shop downtown. If there was something wrong with it, they must have made a mistake." "Funny thing about that," Agent Martinez continued, "we checked every specialty coffee shop in a 50-mile radius. None of them carry the blend you described. But we did find the chemical supply company where you purchased the individual components. They keep very detailed records." For the first time, Jessica's composure cracked, just for a moment, but enough for me to see the cold calculation underneath. As they led Michael and Jessica away in handcuffs, my son turned back to me one last time. The mask had finally fallen away completely, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't love or regret or even guilt. It was pure hatred. "You think you've won, old man?" he snarled, his voice nothing like the gentle tone he'd used for months. "You think this changes anything? I still wish you were dead. I still wish I'd never been born into this pathetic family." Those words hit harder than any physical blow could have. This wasn't temporary insanity or momentary greed. This was who Michael really was, who he'd always been underneath the performance. I'd spent 37 years loving a lie. As the house fell silent again, I sat in my recliner holding that poisoned coffee mug, surrounded by the debris of my shattered family. David emerged from wherever he'd been hiding during the arrests, his face grim with shared sorrow. "I'm sorry, Stanley. I know that was hard." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When I finally found my voice, it came out as barely a whisper. How did I not see it? How did I raise a child who could look at me and see only money? David sat down across from me in the chair Michael had occupied just minutes earlier. "Some people are just broken, Stanley. It's not your fault, but it felt like my fault. Every choice I'd made as a father, every lesson I'd tried to teach, every sacrifice Margaret and I had made for our son, it had all led to this moment." Patricia arrived an hour later with news about the legal proceedings. They'll both be facing serious federal charges. With the evidence we've gathered, they're looking at decades in prison. And the company? Fully restored to your control. All of Michael's transactions have been invalidated. Your employee's pension fund will be returned within the week. I should have felt relief or satisfaction or something resembling victory. Instead, I just felt empty. The son I'd loved was gone, had never really existed in the first place. The company I'd built was saved, but what was the point of an empire with no one to inherit it? That night, alone in the house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet, I made the most important decision of my life. 3 months after Michael and Jessica's arrest, I stood in the offices of Morrison Construction watching Martha train her replacement. At 73, she'd decided it was time to retire, and I couldn't blame her. The scandal had taken a toll on everyone who'd worked for the company. "Are you sure about this, Stanley?" she asked for the 100th time. "Morrison Construction has been your life's work." I looked around the office I'd occupied for 40 years. The walls were covered with photos from job sites, awards from the Chamber of Commerce, thank you letters from satisfied clients. It represented 4 decades of honest work, of building something meaningful and lasting. But it also represented the legacy I'd tried to leave my son, the inheritance that had ultimately corrupted him into a monster. "I'm sure, Martha." The decision to sell Morrison Construction hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I couldn't look at the company the same way anymore, couldn't walk through the building without thinking about Michael's betrayal. Every contract bore his forged signature, every terminated employee reminded me of his cruelty. More importantly, I'd realized something during those dark weeks after the arrests. I'd spent so much time building an empire to leave behind that I'd forgotten to actually live. The buyer was a consortium of my longtime employees, Tom Rodriguez, the foreman Michael had fired, along with 8 others who'd been with the company for over a decade. They'd pooled their resources with help from a small business loan to purchase Morrison Construction for exactly what it was worth, $8.5 million. It was less than Michael and Jessica could have gotten by liquidating everything, but money had never been the point. These men understood what the company really represented: honest work, fair treatment of employees, quality construction that would last for generations. "We'll take good care of it, Mr. Morrison," Tom said as we signed the final papers. "Everything you built here, everything you taught us, it'll continue. I know it will. That's why I wanted you to have it." Patricia had handled the legal aspects of the sale, making sure every detail was properly documented. The transaction would be final within 30 days, at which point I would no longer be Stanley Morrison Construction Company owner. I would just be Stanley Morrison, a 67-year-old man with no obligations to anyone but himself. "What will you do now?" Patricia asked as we walked out of the lawyer's office. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. "I'm going to disappear." The plan had been forming in my mind since the night of the arrests. I was going to take Margaret's hidden nest egg, combine it with a portion of the money from selling the company, and start over somewhere completely new, somewhere Michael would never think to look for me, even if he ever got out of prison. David had suggested Florida, anonymous retirement communities where a man with some money could blend in easily, but I had a different destination in mind. Margaret and I had honeymooned in a small coastal town in Oregon called Bandon. We'd always talked about retiring there someday, buying a little house near the ocean, spending our golden years walking on the beach and reading books. Margaret's death had made that dream impossible, but maybe it didn't have to stay buried with her. 2 weeks later, I loaded everything I cared about into a moving truck. It wasn't much: some clothes, a few photo albums from before Michael turned toxic, Margaret's jewelry, and the coffee mug she'd given me for our 20th anniversary. The rest of it, the furniture, the electronics, the accumulated possessions of 40 years in the same house, I donated to charity. Let someone else make new memories with those things. I didn't leave a forwarding address. The house sold quickly to a young couple with 2 small children. Standing in the empty living room where Michael had tried to poison me, watching their kids run excitedly through the rooms, I felt a peace I hadn't expected. This place would have love in it again, real love, not the poisonous imitation my son had offered. Martha was the only person who knew where I was going, and I'd made her promise not to tell anyone, not David, not Patricia, and certainly not any reporters who might come looking for the story of the businessman whose son tried to kill him. The drive to Oregon took 3 days. I took the scenic route, stopping at roadside diners and small-town motels, enjoying the freedom of having nowhere I needed to be and no one expecting anything from me. Bandon was exactly as I remembered it. A tiny community perched on dramatic cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The real estate market was expensive, but I had enough money to buy a small cottage just 2 blocks from the beach. The house was nothing like the sprawling suburban home I'd shared with Margaret and Michael. It was compact, efficient, designed for one person who needed very little to be happy. The living room had a picture window overlooking the ocean, and on clear days I could see fishing boats working the waters where Margaret and I had once walked hand in hand. I furnished it simply: a comfortable chair for reading, a small television, a kitchen table for one. In the bedroom I hung a single photograph, Margaret and me on our wedding day, both of us young and full of dreams we couldn't have imagined would end the way they did. The first few weeks were the hardest. 40 years of routine don't disappear overnight, and I found myself reaching for the phone to call Martha about company business before remembering I no longer had a company. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, ready to review job site schedules that no longer existed. But gradually a new routine emerged. I walked on the beach every morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in colors that changed daily. I discovered the local library, a small building where I could read newspapers and books without anyone asking who I was or what had brought me to town. I started volunteering at the local food bank, helping distribute meals to families who were struggling. The work was simple, honest, and anonymous, exactly what I needed. Most importantly, I started sleeping through the night for the first time in months. No more checking door locks obsessively, no more jumping at unexpected sounds, no more wondering if the people who claimed to love me were actually planning my death. 6 months after moving to Bandon, I received my first letter from Michael. It was forwarded through Patricia's office, postmarked from the federal prison in Colorado where he was serving his sentence. I almost threw it away without reading it. But something made me open it, maybe curiosity, maybe hope that my son had finally found some genuine remorse for what he'd done. The letter was 3 pages of self-pity and blame. Michael was sorry. Sorry he'd been caught. Sorry his plan had failed. Sorry the legal system was persecuting him for trying to help his mentally ill father. He blamed Jessica for manipulating him, blamed me for forcing him into desperate measures, blamed everyone except himself for the choices he'd made. There was no acknowledgement of the months of systematic poisoning, no recognition of the fear and pain he'd caused, no understanding that attempted murder wasn't a reasonable response to impatience with inheritance timing. The letter ended with a request for money for his prison commissary account, and a suggestion that I visit him so we could work things out as a family. I read it twice, then fed it into the fireplace I'd installed in my cottage. Watching it burn, I felt the last connection to my old life dissolve into ash. Michael wasn't my son anymore. He was a stranger who happened to share my DNA, a dangerous man serving time for trying to kill me. I owed him nothing. Not money, not visits, not forgiveness, and certainly not the pretense that we were still family. A year later, I was sitting on my small back deck watching the sunset when my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, knocked on my door. She was a widow about my age who'd moved to Bandon after her husband's death. "Stanley, would you like to join me for dinner tonight? I made too much soup for one person." It was a simple invitation, the kind neighbors make to each other all the time. But it represented something I'd almost forgotten existed: human connection without ulterior motives, kindness without manipulation, companionship without conspiracy. "I'd like that very much," I said. Over dinner, Mrs. Chen told me about her late husband, a teacher who'd spent 40 years helping troubled children. She talked about their travels, their hobbies, their quiet contentment with a simple life well lived. "Do you have children?" she asked. "No," I said without hesitation. I never had children. It wasn't technically true, but it was emotionally accurate. The child I'd raised, the son I'd loved, had never really existed. Michael had been performing from the beginning, waiting for his chance to cash in on the investment of my affection. But Mrs. Chen's husband had touched hundreds of lives through his teaching. Tom Rodriguez and the other employees were carrying on the Morrison construction legacy. The young family in my old house was creating new memories in rooms that had once echoed with false love. Real family, I'd learned, wasn't about blood or legal documents or inheritance rights. It was about people who showed up when you needed them, who cared about your well-being without calculating what they could gain from it. 2 years after moving to Bandon, I received a call from Patricia. Michael had been released early for good behavior and was trying to locate me through legal channels. "He's claiming he needs to contact you for closure," Patricia explained. "His parole officer recommended family reconciliation as part of his rehabilitation program." "What did you tell them?" "That my former client values his privacy and doesn't wish to be contacted. But Stanley, legally there's only so much I can do to keep him away if he's determined to find you." That night, I sat on the beach listening to the waves crash against the rocks and thinking about fear. For months after the arrests, I'd been afraid of Michael, afraid of his anger, his manipulation, his potential for violence. Even 3,000 miles away, the thought of him searching for me brought back that familiar anxiety. But sitting there under a sky full of stars, I realized something important. I wasn't the same man who'd collapsed in his office 18 months earlier. That man had been vulnerable, isolated, desperate for family connection, even when that family was destroying him. This man, the one watching waves under the Oregon sky, had friends who cared about him, work that mattered, and a life worth protecting. I'd found peace in a small town where nobody knew about Morrison construction or family betrayal or attempted murder. If Michael somehow found me, if he showed up at my door with more lies and manipulation and demands, I would handle it. I was no longer the confused, poisoned victim he'd last seen. I was Stanley Morrison, a man who'd built something good from nothing once before and could do it again if necessary. But more than that, I'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. I was alone by choice now, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. And for the first time since Margaret's death, I was genuinely happy. The son I'd raised was gone, had never really existed. But the life I'd found in his absence was more peaceful than anything I'd known in years. Sometimes the best inheritance isn't what you leave behind, it's what you finally allow yourself to keep.